This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can go to cardkingdom.com to order Ravnica Legion's products right now. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsuhone, and we are continuing on with our Ravnica Legion's full set limited review. Today we're looking at Azorius, Rakdos, and Gruul. We've got one more video left before we're done looking at every single card in the set and giving it a grade. After that we still have the archetype guide and the top 10 list about the biggest bombs in the format coming out. Before we get started, if you're not sure what my grades mean, you can go to a link in the description below that will take you to the video that explains how I grade cards. Now, let's move on to our first card, which is an Azorius card. We're going to look at all the Azorius cards first, then all the Rakdos, then all the Gruul. And we're starting with Absorb, which costs 1 white mana and 2 blue mana for a rare instant, and it says counter target spell, you gain 3 life. This is really nothing special and limited. We just had Ionize, which is easier to cast and probably better. Doing 2 damage is better than gaining 3. Plus, Ionize existed in a format where spells matter was pushed pretty hard, making it even more playable. As is, this is just a slight upgrade from Cancel, and Cancel's not something you want to go out of your way to take. If you're Azorius, you probably just count on it wheeling, and if you're not, you just don't want it. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, we have Azorius Knight Arbiter, which for 3 generic, a white and a blue, is a 2/5 human knight at common. It's got vigilance, and it can't be blocked. If you need an evasive creature to win games for you, this can do it kind of slowly while also being a decent blocker. Thing is, blue-white has plenty of other evasive threats, though most of them aren't unblockable, they just have flying. This is a solid card to run in your Azorius deck, and one that it's pretty easy to cut if you end up with enough other win conditions, I think. I think it's a C. Next up, we have Aureus Sky Guard, which for 4 generic, a white and a blue, is a 3/3 human knight at uncommon. It's got flying and first strike, and creatures your opponents control get -1, -0. I like this a fair bit. The -1, -0 to your opponent's whole team effects have impressed me in the past, and in a format with spirit tokens coming out of the woodwork, it may be even better here. Dampening Pulse and Hunter of Nightvale are examples of this effect that we've had before that both ended up being pretty good. What this card has that the others didn't is the fact that it also has decent stats itself and can be either an effective blocker or attacker. I think I am on board with the idea of first picking this over everything that isn't a bomb or premium removal spell, and that means it's a B-. Next up, we have Deputy of Detention, which for 4 generic, a white and a blue, is a 1/3 Vidalcan wizard at rare, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile target non-land permanent opponent controls and all other non-land permanents that player controls with the same name as that permanent until Deputy of Detention leaves the battlefield. So, obviously, a Detention Sphere reference. Fiend Hunter cards are always good, and this is basically Fiend Hunter, except for Detention Sphere is slightly better. It probably won't exile more than one thing in most limited matches. If you ever get to exile like 4 spirit tokens that are beating you down, it's going to feel pretty good, though. Still, it is a powerful removal spell, and that makes it worth first picking to be sure. It's a B. Next up, we have Dovan, Grand Arbiter, which for 1 generic, a white and a blue, is a legendary planeswalker, Dovan at Mythic Rare, and it has 3 loyalty. You can use his +1, and until end of turn, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you put a loyalty counter on him. His -1 creates a colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying, and you gain 1 life. And his ultimate is a -7 that says, look at the top 10 cards of your library, put 3 of them into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So, obviously, this isn't the kind of planeswalker that busts the game open. They didn't really print any of those in this set. Though, if you play him on turn 3 and your opponent has no board state, I guess he'll probably just win you the game. I do think he's good. His +1 is a bit weird and doesn't impact the board, but he can definitely build up his loyalty quickly depending on the board state. That's probably why his ultimate is good, but is certainly not a game-winning one. I think a lot of the time, the best thing to do with him will be to play him, use his +1 and swing with your 2-drop, and then just make a Thopter a turn for a while. Obviously, those Thopters combo with the +1 and can help him build back up, and then you can go back to making Thopters again, and I think that's really what you want him to be doing. You want him to be making a bunch of Thopters. All in all, I think he's good enough to take with the first pick in a lot of packs, but I don't expect him to win the game every time you play him, like a lot of Planeswalkers. I think he's a B-. Next up, we have Dou Viens Acuity, which for 1 generic, a white and a blue, is an uncommon enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life and draw a card. Whenever you cast an instant spell during your main phase, you may return Dou Viens Acuity to its owner's hand. So this isn't quite Disinformation Campaign, but it is another card-drawing engine that is a payoff for a guild mechanic, so there are some similarities. The cool thing about this is that while it really is telling you to play cards with Addendum, you can get value out of any instant during your main phase. It doesn't have to be one with Addendum. For this card to be worth it, you probably need around 7 instants that aren't painful to cast during your main phase, and once you're there, it's going to feel a bit like Disinformation Campaign as it continues to draw you cards and gain you life. Obviously, it isn't on the level the campaign was. You'd rather make your opponent discard a card than gain 2 life. But I think this will be a really fun card to play in an Azorius deck that has met those requirements. I think you should probably avoid playing it if you have 5 or fewer cards that fit the bill in most cases. It's probably like a D. I mean, it is still a 3 mana, you gain 2 life and draw a card effect, which is something, but it's certainly not good. But if you can successfully build around it, I think it's at least a C+. This is a card I'm really hoping works out because it looks like a lot of fun to me. Next up we have Emergency Powers, which for 5 generic, a white, and a blue is a mythic rare instant. Each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library, then draws 7 cards. Then you exile Emergency Powers. It has Addendum, which means you get an extra bonus if you cast it during your main phase instead of, during your opponent's turn or whatever. In this case, you get to put a permanent card with converted mana cost 7 or less from your hand onto the battlefield. This looks like a lot of fun. While this is definitely going to have more power in constructed formats, at least I think, where you can more reliably draw into an obscene win condition, I think it's still going to be pretty nice and limited. With Addendum, you're always going to come out ahead after you cast this, since you'll get a free permanent. This will be especially powerful to cast if your opponent has card advantage over you already. Say they have 2 or 3 cards in their hand and you have 0, so getting you back to 7, both of you back to 7, is a nice option that sort of levels things out. I don't really see a reason why you ever want to cast this without Addendum, though there are probably some corner cases. I think this card will be powerful enough, and it can be good on a large percentage of board states. If you're ahead, it seals the deal. If you're at parity, it pulls you ahead. And if you're behind, it probably gets you to parity. That said, if your opponent is already way ahead of you on the board, the impact of this card will be less. Where to grade this card is a bit challenging, but I think it brings enough power and can really shift a game in your favor, and I think I'm giving it a B. Next up, we have High Alert, which for 1 generic, a white, and a blue is an uncommon enchantment, and it says, each creature you control assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. Also says, creatures you control can attack as though they didn't have Defender, and you can pay 2 generic, a white, and a blue to untap a creature. This seems like an odd place for a Defender build around. There are cards with Defender in this format, but not enough of them for this really to be worth it. Sure, it can also sort of be a high toughness build around, but you don't really want to build a deck with a bunch of creatures with high toughness that'll only be good if you get your High Alert in play. I think it's just an F. It's just not really something you can realistically build around. Next up, we have Lavinia, Azorius Renegade, which for a white and a blue is a 2/2 human soldier, legendary, at rare. Each opponent can't cast non-creature spells with converted mana cost greater than the number of lands that player controls. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell. She was printed with constructed in mind, not limited. In limited, she will just usually be a 2-mana 2/2 that only a blue-white deck can really cast because there aren't going to be enough ways to either cast things that cost more than the number of lands you control or cast things for free in this format. She's just going to be a vanilla 2-drop in an Azorius deck, and that means she's just a D+. Next up, we have Law Mage's Binding, which for 1 generic, a blue, and a white is an aura enchantment at common with flash and enchant creature. An enchanted creature can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can be activated. This is the best common in the set. In fact, when they revealed it unceremoniously with the full spoiler, I assumed it was an uncommon without even looking at the rarity until I was making this video, but it's common. It stops almost all creatures from being relevant, with only creatures who have static abilities really being a problem. And it does this for 3 mana, and it isn't that hard to splash, and it has flash because why not? All of that means that you feel good about first picking this, and you should probably take every one of these that comes your way if you're capable of splashing it. It's just that good. This is a B+. It is better than almost all the rares and the uncommons in the set even, and again, it's common. Next up, we have Senate Guildmage, which for a white and a blue is a 2/2 human wizard and uncommon. It, of course, as Guildmages do, has 2 activated abilities. You can pay 1 white mana and tap it to gain 2 life. You can pay 1 blue mana to draw a card, then discard a card. I think this Guildmage is pretty good. It might be the best one in this set. I mean, it's a little early to figure out which that is, but I really like this one. Its activated abilities are way cheaper than all the other Guildmages, and yes, the gain 2 life one isn't hugely impactful, but I think looting for 1 blue mana is pretty great. That's just a great effect that's going to have a lot of late game viability that will help you draw into whatever it is you need to win the game. Your draws are just going to be better than your opponents in the long run, and that can really win you a game. She can gain you life if that's really what you need to do to get out of danger, and she's still a 2-mana 2/2. I think all of that makes her a Guildmage that I'm thinking about first picking sometimes. That makes her a B-. Next up, we have Sphinx of New Prague, which for 2 white and 2 blue is a 4/3 Sphinx at uncommon. It's, that part of the cycle where the card costs 2 mana of each guild color. It has flying and vigilance. Spells your opponent's cast that target it cost 2 more to cast. A 4 mana 4/3 with flying and vigilance is probably already a B-. But it is hard to cast it does have an additional ability that, makes your kill spells more expensive. Your opponent's going to have a hard time sort of trading even with this. They're going to frequently have to pay more mana than you paid for the Sphinx to kill it, which is nice. But I don't think that adds that much value to it. It adds a little bit. I think it sort of makes it so that the difficult casting cost here is a wash. And it means you can first pick this in a lot of packs despite its difficult casting cost, because it can just win the game in the air very quickly. It's a B-. Next up, we have Sphinxes Insight, which for 2 generic, a white and a blue. It's a common instant, draws you 2 cards, and it has addendum. If you do the main phase thing, you also get to gain 2 life. So yeah, this is like a split card. It's either a 4-mana draw 2 at instant speed or a 4-mana divination that gains you 2 life. Both halves of that card are reasonable, but certainly not exciting. I think this is a solid C. Next up, we have Senate Griffin, which for 2 generic and 2 blue-white hybrid mana is a Griffin at common. It has flying. It's a 3/2, and when it enters the battlefield, you scry 1. This is another nice common. We've had a lot of reasonably efficient flyers with scry at common lately, and this is definitely another one of those. 4-mana 3/2 flyers are probably a C on the vanilla test, and adding the scry is great because, as scry does, it helps you improve your next draw. This is a C+. Next, we have Depose or Deploy. It's a split card. There's a split uncommon card and a split rare card. The rare card we're going to look at next. The uncommon one is Depose or Deploy, which is actually my preview card. And the Depose half lets you pay 1 generic and 1 blue or white hybrid mana. And it's an instant. And it says tap target creature, draw a card. The Deploy half for 2 generic, a white, and a blue is an instant. It creates 2 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature tokens with flying. Then you gain 1 life for each creature you control. Split cards are nice because of the flexibility they bring, and both sides of this have their place. I think something like 90% of the time you want to be casting Deploy because it's actually very efficient for what it does and can maybe get you a win condition in play. At worst, 4 mana to make 2 Thopters and gain 2 life is a fine deal, especially at instant. Those Thopters may be a little weaker in a format, mostly because of Afterlife, but even taking that into account, it seems pretty good. The Depose half can sometimes offer a lot, like getting a key blocker out of the way or using it on turn 3 if you miss your land drop. I don't see a reason why you would ever not play this in an Azorius deck, and it might even be a nice splash in already token-heavy Orzhov decks. I don't quite think I want to be taking this with a first pick, but I think it gets pretty close. I think it's a C+. Next up, we have Warrant or Warden. The Warrant half, this is the rare split card, by the way. The Warrant half costs 2 blue-white hybrid mana. It's an instant, and it says put target attacking or blocking creature on top of its owner's library. That's always a nice card. The Warden half for 3 generic, a white, and a blue gives you a 4/4 white and blue Sphinx creature token with flying and vigilance. It's a sorcery. Seems like a lot of the rare split cards in this set have like a nice removal spell on one side and then like a creature token on the other side, which kind of seems lazy. But that doesn't mean they aren't going to be good. One half of this lets you time map a creature to the top of your opponent's library for only 2 mana. It does have to be attacking or blocking, but luckily those things happen a lot. Something that I think often gets lost when people see effects like this is just how much better putting it on top of their library is than bouncing it. When you just bounce a creature, you are getting some tempo, but you go down a card in an effort to do so in most cases. An effect like this actually gives you tempo most of the time, the same thing where you're bouncing something that costs more than it does, and it also takes a full card away from your opponent because they have to draw it again. They're not going to draw a new card next turn, they're drawing what you put on top of their library. An effect like that can still be kind of annoying if your opponent has creatures with enter the battlefield abilities, but I still think it's a pretty good spell. I think on its own it would at least be a C+ and maybe even a B-. Then when you add the Warden half, which can make an efficient Sphinx where, sometimes, especially in the late game, where you're in top deck mode, you probably want the 4/4 flyer more than you want to be warranting something. And when it can do that, that's great. That flexibility of having both sides, which are nice for their mana cost, is enough to make this first pickable. I think it's a B. Now we're moving to Rakdos. Our first Rakdos card is Bedevil, which for 2 black and a red is a rare instant that says destroy target artifact, creature, or planeswalker. So this is an excellent and extremely flexible instant speed removal spell. Even though it has a mana cost that may be a bit difficult if you don't end up in Rakdos, the upside here is really good. I think most of the time it's just murder. There aren't that many artifacts or planeswalkers in this set, but murder's a B+. I think this is a B+ too. It can kill things at instant speed for only 3 mana, and that's great. Next up, we have Captive Audience, which for 5 generic, a black and a red is a mythic rare enchantment, and it enters the battlefield under the control of an opponent of your choice. It's a wacky one. At the beginning of your upkeep, choose one, and this means your opponent is making this decision because they control it, that hasn't already been chosen. Your life total becomes 4. Discard your hand. Each opponent creates 5 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. This is a really cool card design-wise. Is it good for limited, though? I think Probably not. 7 mana to play this is a doozy. And yeah, it has some impact on the board during your opponent's next turn, but the immediate impact will be whatever matters to them the least. What's more is, while it definitely can help you win a game, there are going to be a decent number of board states where one of two things happens. Your opponent kills you before a relevant option affects them, since you just spent 7 mana on something that isn't developing the board in a real way. If your opponent's ahead of you, you're in really bad shape. If your opponent's, reasonably ahead of you, they could maybe choose all 3 of these and still not be behind. This card is just so erratic and so difficult to judge how effective it will be when it comes into play, and I think most of the time the effects that it has just aren't going to be enough to make it worth playing the 7 mana enchantment in your deck. It isn't something that just wins you the game necessarily, and for that reason, I think it's just an F. I could be wrong about this one. I could be steering clear of it just because it seems so inconsistent, but I think that's a pretty good reason to steer clear of a card. So yeah, I'm giving it that F. Next up, we have Colt Guildmage, which for a black and a red is a 2/2 human shaman at uncommon. You can pay 3 generic and a black and tap it to have your opponent discard a card. You can only use it at sorcery speed. You can also use an ability that pays 1 red and tap it to deal 1 damage to target opponent or planeswalker. Like all guild mages, you'll feel good about having this in your Rakdos deck. The first ability can be used to really disrupt your opponent, especially later in the game, and the second ability provides you with some nice reach, not to mention a way to easily make it so you can cast cards for their spectacle cost. I do think he falls a little short from being a guild mage that's so good that you want to first pick him. I think he's a C+, but yeah, I mean, he's going to be great in your Rakdos cult decks. Next up, we have Fireblade Artist, which for 1 black and a red is a 2/2 human shaman at uncommon. It has haste, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, you may sacrifice a creature. When you do, Fireblade Artist deals 2 damage to target opponent or planeswalker. A 2 mana 2/2 with haste is an okay thing, probably a C. Add to that the ability to start hurling your creatures at your opponent when they are low on life. And you have what I think is a pretty good card. It can help you enable Spectacle, obviously. It can help you enable Sacrifice synergies. If you sacrifice something with Afterlife to it, that's going to be especially nice. I think this is a solid card for Rakdos decks. I think it's a C+. Next up, we have Get the Point, which for 3 generic, a black, and a red is an instant at common, and it says destroy target creature, scry 1. This is a nice removal spell for 5. Killing anything for 5 is usually premium removal, especially at instant speed with scry attached. Being instant speed only opens up the chance for blowing out the opponent if they try to do something like a trick or an aura. I think this is first pickable despite being gold because it's such a good removal spell, and there aren't that many good monocolored removal spells. We're going to see a lot of better removal spells in these gold videos than we did in the monocolored videos, and I think that may increase its value a little, but it's a B-. Next up, we have Hackrobat, which for 1 generic, a black, and a red is a 2/3 human rogue at uncommon. It has Spectacle for a black and a red. This is an alternate cost you can pay if your opponent has lost life this turn, which includes you doing damage to them. It has 2 activated abilities. One of them you pay 1 black and it gains Death Touch. The other one you pay 1 red and it gets +2/-2 until end of turn. So if we take Spectacle off of this, it's probably already a C+. It has 2 nice activated abilities. One that is great when your opponent can't really block, so she can get in for some extra damage, and the other better when you're on defense and needing to trade with anything. Obviously, Death Touch can be useful for attacking too. You could turn on the Death Touch to deter your opponent from blocking, and after no blocks are declared, make her hit for 4. The better thing to do is actually just to attack with her and have the threat of activation so that you keep that black mana if they decide not to block. So she's a 3-drop that's good all game, thanks to those abilities. The fact that she has Spectacle isn't going to come up a ton because 1-drops aren't usually played a lot in Limited, and enabling her to be played on turn 2 is difficult, but when you do it, it's going to be awesome. The Spectacle does matter in the later game, or maybe it lets you cast 2 spells in 1 turn. Overall, though, I think she's a C+. She's just a nice, well-rounded card that has a lot of different uses. Next up, we have Judith, the Scourge Diva, who for 1 generic, a black and a red, is a 2/2 legendary creature human shaman at rare. Other creatures you control get +1/+0, and whenever a non-token creature you control dies, she does 1 damage to any target. So she's pretty good. A 3-mana 2/2 that pumps your whole board is already pretty nice. The rest of the text on it also is pretty awesome, since unlike most versions of this type of effect, she can even hit creatures. One thing to note that they did, probably to suppress her power a bit, is that it says non-token, so you can't splash her in your Orzhov decks and take advantage of spirit tokens. Not exactly, anyway. You'll still want to splash her there because she pumps your spirit tokens, and when you trade cards with your creatures with Afterlife, she'll still get to do 1 damage to something. Overall, she seems pretty good, and I think that makes her worth being first pickable despite being gold. I'm giving her a B-. Next up we have Mccobb Mockery, which for 2 generic, a black and a red is an uncommon instant, and it says put target creature card from an opponent's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. It gets +2/+0 and gains haste until end of turn. Sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. This is a weird card, and not an easy one to evaluate. I think that it being dependent on the opponent's graveyard to some degree is kind of a pain, but at the same time it is flexible once something is in that graveyard. You can use it to get an opponent's creature back from the graveyard so that it can block and kill another one of their creatures, basically making this a very complicated kill spell. You can use it at the end of your opponent's turn to get one of their creatures, and then you'll have it on your turn, though it won't have the +2/+0 anymore. But if you want to use the mana on your turn for something else, that is an option. Then the most obvious option is just the one where you use this on your own turn to get in for some extra damage, maybe getting some really sweet creature back from your opponent's graveyard for a turn, maybe even one with an enter the battlefield ability. So I think this will be frustrating sometimes because of how reliant you are on your opponent's graveyard, but at the same time, once that graveyard has creatures in it, it can do a wide variety of things, and it does an okay job at all of them. I think it's a C. Next, we have Rafter Demon, which for 2 generic, a black and a red is a 4/2 demon at common. It has Spectacle for 3 generic, a black and a red, and when it enters the battlefield, if its Spectacle cost was paid, each opponent discards a card. I'm not that impressed here. A 4-mana 4/2 is mediocre stats, so that baseline isn't so good. The fact that you can cast it for 5 with Spectacle and have it become a beefy Ravenous Rats is fine, but still really not that special. 5 mana for a 4/2 that makes your opponent discard a card, I don't think that would make the cut most of the time. I'm giving it a D+. Next up we have Rakdos Firewheeler, which for 2 black and 2 red is a 4/3 human rogue and uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield it deals 2 damage to target opponent and 2 damage to up to 1 target creature or planeswalker. So, I mean, yeah, this whole cycle is pretty strong, just like last time. Some of them are going to be worth first picking despite difficult mana costs, but they are all going to be incredible when your deck has no problem casting them. So their grade isn't really a reflection of like how good it is in your deck if you can cast it in your deck. They're all probably like a B or a B-. The grade that I'm giving them is sort of a reflection of whether or not it's right, really, to take them early and sort of commit to it because they're so hard to cast if you don't end up in those 2 specific colors. This is good though, a 4-mana 4/3 that does 2 to a creature and your opponent, but I don't think it quite gets there into the B range in terms of wanting to first pick it. Obviously, it's going to be incredible if you're in Rakdos. I'm giving it a C+ though to reflect the fact that it isn't a big enough thing to make me go after it with like my first or second pick in most cases. Next up we have Rakdos Roustabout, which for 1 generic, a black and a red is a 3/2 Ogre Warrior at common, and when it becomes blocked, it deals 1 damage to the player or planeswalker it's attacking. 3 mana 3/2s are usually like a D+, and this one does come with an additional ability, but it's hardly an expectable one. You probably run him if you have a boatload of Spectacle going on, since he can make sure you do damage to your opponent, but if he's not also like trading with the creature at the same time, getting Spectacle out of him isn't usually going to be worth it. I think you're better off playing a better Spectacle enabler, of which there are several, but he is playable. He's a C-. Next up we have Rakdos, the Showstopper, which for 4 generic, a black and a red is a 6/6 demon at Mythic Rare. He's got Flying and Trample, and when he enters the battlefield, you flip a coin for each creature that isn't a demon, devil, or imp. Destroy each creature whose coin comes up tails. The new Rakdos is nice, another example of Flample, which comes in handy in a world of spirit tokens, and obviously it has an efficient body. His real power, though, does come from that trigger. It does affect your opponents as well as you, but I think that's okay. Giving you a 50% chance to kill each individual creature your opponent has is well worth it when attached to a huge creature like this one, who you don't have to flip a coin for. You know he's staying in play. You can also build around him a bit. Rakdos, always has demons, devils, and imps. Those are in this set, and they do go up a little bit in value if you have Rakdos, the Showstopper. He's also a great finisher in any deck that doesn't have a ton of creatures, though I think your average Rakdos deck probably has a lot. All in all, I do think he's really great. The coin flip thing does keep me from really wanting to say he's like an A- because of the fact that it's just so erratic, but I think he gets pretty close. I think he's a B+. Next up we have Theater of Horrors, which for 1 generic and a black and a red is a rare enchantment. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library. During your turn, if an opponent lost life this turn, you may play cards exiled with Theater of Horrors, and you can pay 3 generic and a red to have it do 1 damage to target opponent or planeswalker. So I like this card a lot. It reminds me a lot of cards like Phyrexian Arena and Outpost Siege, these cards that just give you insane card advantage that snowballs until you win the game. Worth noting that the cards stay in exile even if you don't cast them that turn. A lot of times we see this sort of effect and it's like, the card disappears because you can never get it out of exile again. That's not the case with Theater of Horrors. Even if you don't get the sort of pseudo-spectacle going here, anytime you finally do damage to your opponent, you suddenly have access to all the cards it's exiled so far. And that is just insane. It can obviously also, essentially, pay 4 mana to do 1 damage to an opponent or planeswalker, which kind of draws you a card as long as this stays in play. I think this is an incredible card. It's the kind of card that if you play on turn 3, a lot of the time you're just going to win the game. It's good late too, though. It's just going to grind out a lot of wins. It is incredibly powerful. It is an A-. I think you first pick it on a regular basis, like you would a Phyrexian Arena or Outpost Siege. Next, we have Footlight Fiend, which for 1 black-red hybrid mana is a 1/1 devil. So, hey, Rakdos works with Rakdos. And when it dies, it deals 1 damage to any target. So, this is obviously a spectacle enabler. It can also take down 2 toughness creatures in combat, and if your opponent ends up in a situation with 2 X1s in play, it can be especially nasty. It's also kind of nice to sacrifice to other stuff because it has a nice death trigger. Overall, I'm not impressed, though. I think it's probably a D+, but if your opponent just has a ton of X1s, it does probably creep up to a C- and might be worth siding in. Next up, we have Bedeck and Bedazzle, the rare split card for Rakdos. The Bedeck half is 1 black-red, 2 black-red hybrid mana, and it's an instant, and it says target creature gets +3, -3 until end of turn. The other half is Bedazzle, and it's 4 generic, a black and a red for an instant that destroys a non-basic land, and it deals 2 damage to target opponent or planeswalker. This is a weird one. For the other split rare cards in this cycle, both in Guilds and Allegiance, the more expensive half was also a pretty good card, and that's not the case here. The Bedeck half is nice. It will be frequently used just as a removal spell, but having the flexibility to help one of your big creatures do lethal doesn't hurt either. The other half, the Bedazzle half, is pretty awful and limited, though. I think you cast Bedeck 99.9% of the time here. There may be rare occasions where you really need to blow up your opponent's only source of some color, and then maybe it's worth using the Bedazzle half. So basically, you're never using the Bedazzle half, but the Bedeck half is a good removal spell that also happens to be occasionally a way to pump your creature to lethal, and I think the Bedeck half on its own is a B-, so that's what I'm going to give it. Next up, we have Carnival or Carnage. The Carnival half on this uncommon split card is black-red hybrid for an instant, and it deals 1 damage to target creature or planeswalker, and 1 damage to that permanent's controller. The Carnage half is 2 generic, a black, and a red, and it says it's a sorcery, and it says it deals 3 damage to an opponent. That player discards 2 cards. I'm not that impressed with this. 1 damage to do 1 to a creature or planeswalker or player is kind of okay. You know, it does enable Spectacle. That's kind of the idea here. And, you know, if something happens where Carnival is worth casting to kill like a 3/1, you probably do it. And the Carnage half is, you know, a more expensive Blightning. And Blightning, while all right, isn't that great and limited. I mean, it's a Mind Rot that does some damage, sure. This is the same thing, except it costs 1 more mana. And I'm not really that interested in casting it. Again, it is a flexible card, so you have 2 halves here, neither of which is very exciting. I think each half individually is probably like a C-. But together, they do give you the flexibility to use whichever is going to be the most advantageous at the time, and I think that does push them up to a C. Alright, so that's our last Rakdos card. Now we'll move to our last guild for the day, which is Gruul. First up, we have Bulrak Clan Crusher, who for 3 generic, a red, and a green is a 4/4 Ogre Warrior in uncommon. You can tap it and remove a +1/+1 counter from a creature you control, and he deals 2 damage to any target. This seems like a lot of fun. A 5-mana 4/4 doesn't do a great job in the vanilla test, but it's not completely terrible. Add to that a powerful activated ability, and you get a pretty good card on your hands. Both Gruul and Simic, of course, have +1/+1 counters going on, so this may be at its best in a 3-color deck. He works particularly well with Adapt, because you can just keep putting counters on your creature and sacrificing them, because you can use Adapt as long as your creature doesn't have the +1/+1 counters, so it sort of turns into a factory. But he also works with Riot, too. I do think he's a build-around. I mean, I think your average Gruul deck will have no problem getting 3 to 4 +1/+1 counter things going on, so I think it will be solid in your average Gruul deck, which means it's like a C. But if you really get there on +1/+1 counters, I think it pushes itself all the way up to the B range. And what I mean by gotten there is like 7 or more ways to put counters on things. Next up, we have Cinder Vines, which for a red and a green is a rare enchantment. And it says whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, deals 1 damage to them. You can also pay 1 and sacrifice it to destroy a target artifact or enchantment, and it deals 2 damage to that permanent's controller. Mostly, I think this is just a very good sideboard card. Most decks won't run enough non-creatures for the 1 damage to make a big difference in limited, but paying 3 to destroy an artifact or enchantment and do 2 damage is a pretty good sideboard card. I think you could probably mainboard this, but you're going to be kind of disappointed. I think it's probably a D there. but it is probably the best naturalized in the format, which is nice for the sideboard against some opponents. I think it goes all the way up to a B- in a sideboard card. I want to note that just because it has like a grade that means sometimes first pickable as its sideboard grade, that doesn't really mean you should. It will just perform as a card would that's like that level against opponents where it has good targets. So I wouldn't say take this early, but it's probably the best sideboard card in the entire set, and that's saying something. Next up, we have Clan Guildmage, which for a red and a green is a 2/2 human shaman at uncommon. You can pay 1 generic and a red to tap it, and target creature can't block this turn. Or you can pay 2 generic and a green to make a land you control a 4/4 elemental with haste until end of turn. It's still a land. I like this. Obviously, he's pushing Gruul's aggressive theme, and he does a good job of it. Cards that can repeatedly make creatures unable to block tend to be pretty nice in aggro decks. Oftentimes, making one thing unable to block just makes it so way more of your creatures can attack. I feel like the ability will be used more frequently than the one that makes the elemental creature, but that one's okay too. You can use it to get in for some more damage. You can even use it, the elemental creature, on defense if you need a beefy blocker, and your opponent will have to respect the threat of activation. Overall, this is a good Guildmage, the kind that isn't quite first pickable on its own, but, you know, sort of like the other cards, guild cycle cards. If you can play it in your deck, it's probably going to perform like a B or a B-, but I'm giving it a C+ to reflect the fact that I think I'd rather take a monocolored, you know, B-, B over it than I would an uncommon. That's gold. Next up, we have Doe Murray Chaos Bringer, who for 2 generic, a red and a green, is a legendary Planeswalker Doe Murray at Mythic Rare. He's got 5 loyalty. You can use a +1 that adds red or green to your mana pool, and if you spend that mana on a creature, it gains Riot. You can also pay -3 to look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal up to 2 creature cards from among them and put them in your hand. And he's got a -8 that says you get an emblem with at the beginning of each end step, create a 4/4 red and green beast creature token with trample. So this is good, but it's another one of these Planeswalkers that isn't like the Planeswalkers we used to see where they were all just absurd. I like that he starts at 5 loyalty. I think the fact that he does is what helps make him better than he is. Like, if he started with 3 or 4 loyalty and had the same abilities, I think he'd be considerably worse, not just a little worse. I think 5 loyalty is a ton, means he can tick up to 6 right away, and the fact that he can't really protect himself doesn't matter as much because his loyalty is so high. Adding Riot to your creatures is really nice. Ramping is really nice. The -3 being able to draw you 2 cards, essentially, hopefully. Sometimes you're not going to hit 2 because it's only the top 4, but if he can draw you 2, that's nice too. His ultimate, while not like the kind that can win the game in a turn or 2, will win the game in the long run. And he's not that far from it when he comes down. But what he really needs is friends able to block for him while he does all his silly things. And, you know, to be fair, he does help you get a creature into play that can block for him, a bigger creature, and he can make it bigger thanks to Riot. So he kind of indirectly can protect himself in a way because he makes blockers better, and I think the goal is really to get to the ultimate here because that's the most powerful thing. But, you know, if you have to play him and use the -3 right away because the board is looking really scary, that's not too terrible either. Overall, I think he is first pickable. I think he's strong enough to be that. He can take over a game to some extent, but he's not going to be like the card that wins you the game immediately, and he's a B-. Next up, we have Frenzied Errinx, which for 2 generic, a red and a green, is a 3/3 cat beast at common. It's got Riot, it's got Trample, and you can pay 4 generic, a red and a green, to give it +3, +0 until end of turn. So, you know, these cards with Riot are kind of like split cards. It's either, this example is either a 4-mana 3/3 with haste and trample, or a 4-mana 4/4 with trample. Both options are nice, especially when coupled with the activated ability. While it obviously is expensive, it has undoubtedly got a lot of upside in the late game with the help of its ability. That's what I mean is expensive, his activated ability. This is a solid common for Gruul, and I think you're always going to feel fine about playing like as many as you see, but I don't think it's quite so powerful you want to first pick it. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we have Gruul Spellbreaker, which for 1 generic, a red and a green, is a 3/3 Ogre Warrior at rare. It's got Riot, it's got Trample, and as long as it's your turn, you and Gruul Spellbreaker have Hexproof. So this Riot creature can either be a 3-mana 3/3 with haste and trample, or a 3-mana 4/4 with trample, plus that whole hexproof clause. That's a pretty powerful and efficient creature, and one that I think is worth considering with your first pick. I don't think you want to take it over like removal or bombs or anything, and there are probably, you know, a decent number of uncommons and a few commons that you would take over it, but it is first pickable over the vast majority of cards in the set, which means it's a B-. Next up, we have Nikya of the Old Ways, which for 3 generic, a red and a green, is a 5/5 legendary Centaur Druid at rare. You can't cast non-creature spells, but whenever you tap a land for mana, add 1 mana of any type that land produced. So a 5-mana 5/5 is pretty nice on the vanilla test. Not being able to cast creature spells is kind of a pain, but making it so that mana you produce doubles for all your creature spells and for activated abilities, that's pretty good. I think most Gruul decks will probably only run 3 to 5 non-creature spells anyway, and sometimes turning them off will get you. But if your deck has some nice high curve creatures and creatures with activated abilities, I think this will be worth it. On the flip side, I think there are going to be some decks where this is the top of your curve, and the fact that it doubles your mana doesn't really matter as much as the fact that it's a 5-mana 5/5, but it could enable some ridiculous things mana-wise. I think this is good. I think it's first pickable in a lot of packs. It's a B-. Next up, we have Ravager Worm, which for 3 generic, a red, and 2 green is a 4/5 worm at Mythic Rare. It's got Riot, and when it enters the battlefield, you can either have it fight target creature you don't control or destroy target land with an activated ability that isn't a mana ability. I like this card a ton. No matter what you decide to do with this, and there are lots of options, you will easily get more than 6 mana of value out of it. Either a 6-mana 5/6 or a 6-mana 4/5 with haste is nice when combined with a fight effect, which is probably what you're going to do 99% of the time. And you can decide to do whichever is more impactful, and that kind of flexibility is great. If your opponent only has 1 blocker and it's a 4/4 or smaller, you can kill it with the fight and then attack in with the worm. If you need 5 power to take something down, well, you can make him bigger. The one thing he doesn't have going for him, he isn't as splashable as some of these other gold bombs because he has double green, but that's not too much of an issue. Basically, this is an incredible version of Affectionate Indrik. I think it's probably worth first picking in most packs, despite the mana requirements. Most packs is an understatement. I think it's worth first picking over everything that's not a monocolored bomb, basically. And that means he's an A. He's a removal spell that comes with a huge body. Next, we have Rhythm of the Wild, which for 1 generic, a red, and a green is an uncommon enchantment. Creature spells you control can't be countered, and non-token creatures you control have Riot. So, the non-counterpart isn't going to come up very often, but giving Riot to everything is interesting. It isn't quite as impactful as like an Anthem effect because this only makes creatures better that come after it, but I could see playing a 2-drop, playing this, and then playing creatures from turn 4 and 5 and being in great shape. That said, it also means that this is horrendous as a late-game top deck. It has to get down early to be at its best, and I think that requirement keeps us from being anything special. I think playing it in an aggressive Gruul deck is probably okay. I'm going to give it a C. Next up, we have Rubble Belt Runner, which for 1 generic, a red, and a green is a 3/3 Viashina Warrior at common, and it can't be blocked by creature tokens. A 3-mana 3/3 is always fine. The token thing here is relevant sometimes with Afterlife, but it isn't enough to make it any better than a 3-mana 3/3 would already be, which is a C. Next up, we have Savage Smash, which for 1 generic, a red, and a green is a common sorcery. Target creature you control gets +2/+2 until end of turn. It fights target creature you don't control. This is a fight card. There are shades of Savage Punch here. Fight cards that make your guys' toughness and power bigger are usually pretty great in Limited because it makes a large percentage of your creatures good targets for it. Unlike just straight fight effects, you don't have to hope that you end up with a critical mass of large creatures because this will even make 1/1s and 2/2s fight reasonably well. It has the usual downside, of course, that all fight cards have. You can get blown out if your opponent has removal, so I advise picking your spots with it carefully, but when you do use it in the right situation, it's going to be incredibly powerful. All of this makes this a really good removal spell for Gruul decks, and I think is even one worth considering first picking. I think it's potentially, not potentially, I think it's premium removal, and I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have Sunder Shaman, who for 2 red and 2 green is a 5/5 giant shaman at uncommon. He can't be blocked by more than 1 creature, and when he deals combat damage to a player, destroy target artifact or enchantment that player controls. Like all the cards in this cycle, this is good. A 4-mana 5/5 that can't be blocked by more than 1 thing is great. There just aren't going to be that many creatures that can take this down in combat. It's nice to know that when you attack with them that no double blocking can happen, and attacks are going to feel pretty safe. It's a very real evasive ability. The rest of the text on there will come up sometimes. There are auras around, of course. Some of them are removal spells. Some of them, are enhancing your own creatures. And there's a lot of enchantments in this set, too, and a good number of them are playable. It won't come up a ton, but it's pretty nice to add that to a beefy creature. Overall, I do think this guy is in the lower range of first pickable despite his horrible mana cost. I'm giving him a B-. Next up, we have Jur-Ta Goblin, which for a red and a green is a 2/2 uncommon Goblin Berserker with Riot. So he's either a 2-mana 3/3 or a 2-mana 2/2 with haste. Both options are good individually on their own. I think those would both be at least C+s, and, he's got that flexibility, and that makes him a C+. Next, we have Rubble Slinger, which for 2 generic and a hybrid red-green mana is a common human warrior with reach and is a 2/3. 3 mana, 2 3s with reach, do an okay job of shutting down small flyers, and attacks okay. It's nothing special, but I think you feel fine about playing the first copy. It's a C. Next up, we have Collision or Colossus, the uncommon split card for Gruul. The Collision half is 1 generic and red or green hybrid mana to do 6 damage to target creature with flying. It's an instant. The Colossus half is a red and a green, also an instant, and target creature gets +4/+2 and gains trample until end of turn. So if you look at each side of this card, the Collision half is a sideboard card. It wouldn't make your main board. The Colossus half is a good combat trick, and good combat tricks still don't usually get out of the C range, and I think it is probably just a C if all you got was the Colossus half. It's certainly powerful, but it's expensive, and, you know, it has the problems all combat tricks have. Things have to be lining up just right for you to get the full advantage out of it, and for me, that makes most combat tricks very, very difficult to get anywhere above a C. But when you combine both of these together, one half a powerful sideboard card that when you have it stapled to a card that's already playable, like Colossus, is definitely worth it. All of that together makes this a C+. I don't think you want to first pick it, but I think you're happy to play like 2 of these in your Gruul decks. Next up, we have Thrash or Threat, the rare split card. The Thrash half is 1 red, 2 red-green hybrid mana. It's an instant. And it says target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker you don't control. The Threat half is 2 generic, a red and a green for a sorcery, and it creates a 4/4 red and green beast creature token with trample. This is a great card for this cycle. One side of it's a premium removal spell in Thrash. The other side is a nice card. It's a lot like the Azorius one of these we saw. One side's a removal spell. The other side is a creature. Most of the time, I think you probably want to save the removal spell to be what's used. But just like that other card, if you end up in top deck mode and what you really need is a creature to pressure your opponent, Threat can do it. Overall, this is definitely first pickable. The Thrash half, by the way, you know, because it's hybrid mana, can be played in multiple decks. It does cost double, and so Gruul's the easiest place to cast it, but anyone can, and I think that makes it a little more first pickable than, you know, it would be otherwise because it's easier to play in like your Rakdos deck. Overall, it's a B. You should first pick it. All right, so we're done with this video. Next, we're going to be looking at Orzhov's Simic Artifacts and Lands. That'll be what we're looking at tomorrow. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. And if you want to see the rest of my Ravnica Legions content, future set reviews, all of that, don't forget to